Hello and welcome back to Diddy on Trial from the BBC World Service YouTube channel with me, Anoushka Mutanda-Dougherty. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss a thing. Here at the Southern District of New York Court in Lower Manhattan, it is the same, what one journalist has described to me as circus, as it usually is. Justin, Diddy's son, just walked past and got absolutely mobbed by influencers and news agencies and people just walking past on the street. So yeah, nothing's really changing. But before we get into things today, a reminder. Diddy is on trial for charges of sex trafficking, transportation for prostitution, and racketeering with conspiracy. These are charges he's consistently denied. A warning, this episode contains descriptions of violence. Now, this is our weekly roundup episode, and later we'll be hearing from our resident criminal defense attorney, Shaun Kent, who's going to be answering some of those questions you've been sending us on WhatsApp. But first, we have the BBC's New York correspondent, Nada Tawfik, to fill us in on what happened today and the rest of the week. So today was the final day of victim 2, who's using the name Jane to protect her identity. Nada, what kind of stuff did she say on the stand today?
The day started actually with a 2-hour delay because there was a debate over whether a famous rapper could be named. And Diddy's lawyer actually complained that Diddy and the public weren't able to hear that conversation between the judge and the parties. But ultimately, the rapper wasn't named. And we find out why that's important because during cross-examination, the defense returned to this incident where Jane flew with a famous rapper and his girlfriend to Las Vegas. And after kind of partying with them and going to a strip club, they later went to a hotel. And she testified about people in the room having a sexual encounter, about half a dozen, while a male escort had sex with the rapper's girlfriend, and they watched. And Jane, under cross-examination, admitted a few things. First, that this was, quote, an icon of the music industry that she flew with. Secondly, that she was kind of dancing and flashed her chest to the people in the room, and that the rapper had approached her and said that he always wanted to have sex with her because he found her so sexy. So we have Jane testifying about an incident where she is in this environment where Diddy is nowhere to be seen. And she's also asked to call an escort that she might know. She calls one up and she tells Diddy's lawyer that perhaps they got the sense from her that she was involved in that kind of swinger lifestyle. And perhaps that's why they asked her. So that was a real key piece of cross-examination today.
Yeah, and the word swinger has become quite important to the defense team.
Diddy wanted to suggest that this was a very normal thing in the music industry and for others like him, that this was part of the swinger lifestyle. Now, what we saw in this instance was kind of the parameters around this lawsuit, not trying to introduce other people and other scenarios in, but here is this one instance where the defense is able to bring attention to the jury that there's another famous rapper. These things are happening in the industry.
Yeah, and for the rest of the day, we focused on some other themes that have been picked up on, particularly finances and stuff that Jane may or may not have been gifted by Diddy.
Yeah, that's right. You know, the defense has tried to suggest that Jane was kind of very jealous of other gifts and trips that Diddy gave to other women, despite Jane admitting that she knew he was not monogamous. And so, again, return to the fact that Diddy invested in a company of hers that now is profitable and didn't expect any return from that, that he paid for her house, that he got her expensive things. You'll remember, yesterday there was a kind of tense exchange about purses, for example. Tenny Garagos, the defense lawyer, asking Jane if she was jealous that she didn't get a Chanel bag, for example, and she said, no, I only got trauma. And later when she was asked about how much a Bottega Veneta bag cost, she said, well, I'm sure you have one, to Tenny, to which she replied, actually, I don't. How much are they? And she said, well, how much is my body worth? So we've seen these tense exchanges, but again, all part of the defense's strategy to show that she was a woman with agency, choices. In their view, that's their argument, and that she was getting things from Diddy, and there were happy times.
Yeah, and they go back to that idea of agency, the notion that Jane might have had some control over Diddy as well, and they spoke about that birthday trip that he takes young Miami on. What did they have to say about that?
Yeah, Jane talks about how she had sex with 3 escorts on her birthday and how it was the last thing she wanted to do. She thought that Diddy was going to kind of have other special plans for her. And she talks about how angry she was to then see that Diddy was off with the rapper Young Miami, who she knew he had started to see, and that he had taken her to Turks and Caicos, which for Jane was a very special place because she said that's where they had kind of begun their relationship, and she had asked him to go back several times. So she was texting him angrily about this, and under cross-examination, we heard that she told Diddy, you better come back from that trip, and that he did actually come back a day early, and that he, took her on another trip after that and continued to spend on her, and, try to make her at least feel a little bit better about that scenario.
And Tenny Garagos, Diddy's defense lawyer, kept returning to some of the things that Diddy bought for Jane: fancy jewelry, high-end restaurants. What was some of the stuff that Jane said that Diddy got for her?
The defense were really trying to draw out that there were other parts to this relationship. And, Jane did admit that Diddy was generous with her at times, was a good boyfriend and lover. That's what she said in some of the text messages to him. And so they asked about some of the things he bought her. So a matching Van Cleef bracelet and necklace, for example, a very expensive jewelry designer. Also expensive restaurant meals with her friends of around $15,000 or more. Trips that cost upwards of $50,000. And this is on top of her house payments and other things. So, Jane was clearly frustrated with this line of questioning, but the defense was bringing this up to show that he was, I guess, trying to give the perception that he was spoiling her and giving her as much as the other girlfriends, that he wasn't singling her out in the way that she has testified to.
So in Jane's direct testimony, she was asked by the prosecution if she could go back and give up all of the stuff that Diddy gifted and bought her in order to never do a hotel night, would she? And she definitively said she would. Now, in cross-examination today, Tenny Garagos asked her if that applied also to the house that Diddy pays the rent for.
Yeah, Jane said that she would, but when she was asked specifically about the house, and remember, this is the house that she shares with her son, she said that that was a difficult question. And this has kind of been what Jane has used as a thread throughout her testimony, that she felt the threat of the roof, over her head being ripped from her if she stopped doing these hotel nights, as she called them. And so when she was pressed on that by Tenny Garagos, Jane saying that was a really difficult question for her to answer.
And then they spoke about how much Jane participated in these hotel nights. Now, she's spoken about performing these sex acts, but today we heard that she actually sometimes booked male commercial sex workers and bought things for them.
The defense wants to paint Jane as somebody who was eagerly willing to participate in these, right? Enthusiastic about these hotel nights. And so they elicited testimony that she bought Rhino performance-enhancing kind of pills for Diddy and the male escorts, and that she also bought them matching shorts, that she even booked some of the hotels herself, and even messages were brought up where she was given kind of options from Diddy about how things should play out, and she was engaging. But again, Jane really tried to hit back to suggest that she knew she couldn't say no, and so she was trying to make the best out of the situation. But the defense really hammering that point because, again, it goes to their central claim here that these were strong, capable women who could have left at any time, and that they were part of this lifestyle as much as Diddy.
Now, another key moment that was built up to in direct testimony and picked up in cross-examination was that fight that the two have in June 2024. Now, we've heard that Jane actually instigated that fight.
So this is actually a key moment that the jury will have to look at. Jane says it was supposed to start off as a chill date night, but she got in an argument with Diddy because of his relationship with another woman that he had a big age gap with. And although she was within age, Jane kept calling him a pedophile, kept telling him, "I hate you." And she admits to actually slamming his head down onto a marble countertop. She said in response, Diddy chased her around the house, kicking down several doors and putting her in a chokehold. Jane said she ran out of her house barefoot and kind of hid out for a few hours. But when she got back, she said Diddy was still there. And she describes him beating her so badly that she had, welts on her forehead, which sounds very similar to what Cassie talked about, bruises. And she said that he handed her ice and told her to ice her injuries and to get ready because he had called over entertainment, a male escort for the night. And he said, "You're not going to be ruining my night." Now, she said that she told him through tears that she didn't want to do it, but he gave her ecstasy and told her, "Is this coercion?" She said she ultimately complied. She gave the male escort oral sex, and she said, "I just felt like I wasn't even in my own body." So that's the incident that Jane talked about. And, under cross, the defense brought this up again because, remember, up until the last year of their relationship, there was no real violence that Jane had testified to. We see it kind of in the last year of their relationship. And the defense has admitted that there was domestic abuse. So the defense, again, trying to paint this as not a very simple dynamic, right, where Diddy had the power over Jane, but rather a relationship that turned toxic.
Nada, thank you so much for filling us in today.
My pleasure.
That was the BBC's New York correspondent, Nada Tawfik, and now it's time to pick up on those questions you've been sending us in for our resident criminal defense attorney, Shaun Kent. So I'm going to head back to the flat, and I'll meet you there.
So the end of last week and the beginning of this week was all about Jane, her direct testimony and her cross-examination. Shaun, I know you're following along with the case. What do you make of the stuff you've been hearing?
I think it's interesting. I think it's fairly obvious that the government has gone to Jane over and over again, trying to get her to cooperate. I think it's pretty obvious from watching her testimony that for the longest, Diddy and his team were convinced that she was not going to testify against him. I think she was given immunity, which makes sense why at the very last moment she says, "I'm going to testify against you." I think that's pretty obvious. And I think her testimony is pretty damning also.
But when you say she's been given immunity, is that because she spoke about things like drug trafficking?
Yes. Don't forget, she had mentioned taking drugs across county lines, across state lines, things of that nature. That would be a crime. That would be something that she's complicit in. He's also charged with transporting for across lines for prostitution. That would be something that she had admitted to, that she had paid money to, and she had gotten these escorts. So those would be two federal crimes that she has admitted to, that they needed her to admit to and not face prosecution for. And there is a possibility that she could be a co-conspirator. And so I think they probably went to her and said, "We'll charge you as a co-conspirator. And if he gets life, you also get life. You better cooperate." I've seen that happen to some of my clients before.
When is the crime too big to offer immunity?
The problem is with the federal government, to get these people, the underlings, if you will, they have to offer immunity to just about everybody. Otherwise, nobody would ever testify. Because this is the federal government. And if they come after you with all their weight, all their power, all their money, all their influence, people are going to say, "Look, I'm not helping unless I get immunity because the numbers are so great. Otherwise, I'm doing 10, 15, 20 years. So they find the person that they want. They make sure everybody else is tangentially related. And they said, "You guys aren't as culpable, if you will. You're not who we want. You're not a danger to the community. So we'll give you all immunity." I think if it's a little bigger, they wouldn't give them immunity. But in these situations, I don't think they consider them a danger.
So we're coming to the end, the tail end of the prosecution's argument. What do you make of it? How strong do you think it is?
Again, as I mentioned when we first started talking, I never thought that anybody was well prepared. I didn't think the defense was well prepared. I didn't think the prosecution was well prepared. Watching this trial, I'm thinking the same, because usually when you see a federal prosecution, you don't see this much great cross-examination of people because there's nothing to cross-examine. Every witness who has taken the stand, every fact witness who has taken the stand has warts. You understand? They all have problems with them. I'm kind of shocked if they're close to wrapping because they haven't had that one witness that ties everything in to prove that this is an overreaching, far-reaching RICO case conspiracy.
They did say this Friday, they're going to bring somebody on who will help tie it all together for the jury, but they won't be a witness that's part of the case. They'll be more in an expert capacity.
Yeah, and they do that a lot of times. They'll bring somebody in, they'll qualify them as an expert. Because if you remember when we talked, I had mentioned that I thought that the sexual trauma expert would be the last witness, because you always want your last witness to be an expert, usually, because those are people who are controllable, that they're almost difficult to cross-examine. So if they get somebody qualified as an expert in RICO, that person can explain it to the jury and then say generically, what this is RICO is. And then guess what? What this guy did was RICO, and then they've tied it all in together. That is somebody who they can utilize. Kind of unfair from a defense attorney standpoint when they're qualified as an expert, but that's something that happens when you're the federal government.
And we've had a bit of conversation this week about jurors, some misinformation online that one was dismissed. They haven't been dismissed, but there has been a request by the prosecution for one of the jurors to be dismissed and then an alternate put in for lack of candor. What does lack of candor actually mean?
One, it is very hard to dismiss a juror mid-trial once a jury has tried it, because you want an individual to have a constitutional right to have the jury that they have selected. So some of the reasons that jurors get dismissed in the middle of trial is sometimes they get sick. Sometimes all of a sudden they tell the judge, I can't be fair and impartial anymore. Sometimes they come back and somebody has found that they have talked to other people. They have had conversations with other people. Somebody has seen them doing something. Those are reasons you get dismissed. You do not get dismissed for rolling your eyes. You don't get dismissed for smiling. You don't get dismissed for laughing. You don't get dismissed if it looks as though you like Diddy. Now, what does happen is the federal government can be watching you. And they're just like, God, that's a bad juror for us. And what would happen in that situation is, man, juror 6 is a bad juror. They lean over their back and they talk to one of their agents. And they said, go dig up information on juror number 6. And they come back, and that's what candor is. Maybe when that person did that questionnaire, you remember that questionnaire we talked about at the very beginning, the long and short of it? If they go and look and they say, they didn't tell us this on their questionnaire. We went into their Facebook profile and we saw that they went to 27 Diddy concerts, or they worked for this, or they worked for Bad Boy. That means they haven't been candor, and candor is truthfulness with the court. That's what candor means.
The other requests we've had are for mistrials from the defense. We've had 2 of those now. Now, the first one was around potentially the narrative being introduced that Diddy was powerful enough to have evidence gotten rid of in the case of Kid Cudi and the arson of his car. And then the other one was about Bana Bongolan's testimony and discrepancies between her accounts and Cassie's accounts, and what Cassie saw and what she didn't, and what the prosecution should have known that Cassie didn't see. So Cassie gets on the stand and testifies that she witnessed this event, but then in text later to Christina Quorum, she talks about hearing about it. And then Bana gave about 2 or 3 different accounts of whether Cassie saw it or Cassie didn't see it during her different meetings with the prosecution, with the federal government. Now, they're saying prosecutorial misconduct because they allowed her to get on the stand and perjure herself.
They said, God understand, and lied.
Was there not some weight to that argument that they made?
Yeah, there is some weight to it. And I was not in the courtroom, but the judge would have said you had full opportunity to cross-examine this person. You had full opportunity to go into their inconsistencies in front of the jury, because that's the point of cross-examination. They put somebody on the stand. You were able to cross-examine them in front of the jury. You got a full and fair ability to cross-examine what they said and show the jury that they were lying and so forth. Now, where it would have been a stronger mistrial is if we didn't find out, because here's the problem. The defense already knew when she got on the stand. So they knew what she had said. That is an inconsistent statement. And if you watch the entire cross-examination by the defense, they have the text messages. They have, well, you said this, but didn't you say this? You said this, but didn't you say this? And that, again, wasn't in the courtroom. The assumption would be the judge would say, you had opportunity to cross-examination. This is not ripe for a mistrial. You were not so unduly prejudiced that you weren't able to cross-examine this witness.
Is there something to calling for a mistrial when it comes to the appeals process and then having that on the record?
Here's the problem. So let's say they did mess up, okay? Let's say his lawyers, let's say the prosecution completely did something dishonest. Well, that's something a jury will hear and they're like, oh my God, I heard that. Well, if the defense does not object and does not cause for a mistrial, the lawyers get in trouble with the state bar because they said, you have done such a bad job on the case. You did not protect your client's rights the way you should have. You get sanctioned and you get in trouble. And number 2, If they do not do that and Diddy appeals, that issue, the issue of them doing something wrong, is not protected for appeal, which means another court can't give him another trial if they think the judge did something wrong. So you must make these objections. It's not that they want to. They have a duty, an affirmative duty when they think that the prosecution has done something illegal. They must make a motion for a mistrial and they must object. If not, they're in trouble.
We've had so many questions coming through. And once again, really, really good detailed questions. I feel like everybody's knuckling down. Here's the first one. It says, hi, I have a question about anonymous witnesses. How is it possible for witnesses like Jane to maintain their anonymity when they seem to be a high profile person who was dating Diddy for several years and has social media profiles, clothing lines, etc.? Wouldn't it be relatively easy to deduce who she is from all the info she is giving in the testimony? And how do they prevent members of the public who are attending the court case from revealing who she is?
Great question. You can put 2 and 2 to figure out who she is. However, if somebody from a courtroom or somebody discloses who she is, technically you're in violation of a federal court order. It is witness intimidation, Sean, and the judge has the ability to hold you in contempt and witness intimidation, and that carries up to 3 years, if I'm not mistaken. So if a judge thinks somebody in the courtroom, specifically the media or somebody, has leaked this person's identity, it would affect her wanting to testify, affect other witnesses. The judge would say, you leaking this information might have caused her not to want to testify differently, affected this trial. You are now in contempt of the court's order, and I can hold you in contempt.
We've got some other great ones as well. I love the pod, but I have to admit that I get lost on the law stuff sometimes. When it's explained, I thought UK law was confusing, but US seems even worse, especially the bit about potentially not including previous behavior in a current charge. Surely previous behavior is key to current and ensuing behavior. No, question mark?
Absolutely. And that's why it's not fair. You want a trial tried on the merits, not what somebody has done in their past unrelated. It would be completely unfair. And the example we give is, let's say my random friend Nushi is on trial in 2025 for selling drugs. And at that trial, the prosecution wants to say, well, you know, Nushi has also sold drugs in 2017, 18, and 19. Well, the jury is likely to say, well, if they did it in 17, 18, and 19, you know what? They probably also did it in 2025, especially if the case in 2025 is weak. That's why we don't want your prior bad acts to come in at your current trial, because then the jury is thinking about the other stuff you did and said it's more likely than not that if you did it in the past, you probably did it in the future. We call that prejudicial. It is more prejudicial than it is probative. Meaning the prejudice is so high that we're not going to get any input out of it. It's not going to help us make our decision. So we just think that's unfair. And so that's why we want to try to keep that away. Now, if Diddy takes the stand, the rule is once you take the stand, your credibility goes on the stand with you. And then all of those prior bad acts can come in via cross-examination. Sean.
Do you think he's going to do it?
Originally, if you want me to be honest, I thought he would. I think he has a fighting chance on some of the charges, and he has a argument to be made based upon the way the prosecution is going so far. At this point in time, if he was my client, I'd advise him not to take the stand. For the first time, I've changed my position that I would advise him not to take the stand at this point as it stands today. I've never hidden that I thought the defense the entire time was going to be consent and coercion. We've talked about that since the rip. They've had one defense. I didn't know if they'd be able to do their defense ably. I think they've done it through the state's witnesses, through the United States witnesses. Is how would Diddy know? From Diddy's standpoint, he's like, I flew them out. I paid for their stuff. They sent me messages and said they enjoyed it. I said, would you want to be a part of this creepy relationship? And they said, yes. And they engaged in it. And then now today, for the first time, they're telling me I didn't want to do this. That's the problem. That's why I thought Jane's text messages were so important, because at least she was saying specifically, I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want this. But they're also showing text messages that showed a different message. So that's why I don't know if he's going to testify, because what the prosecution has done is by putting all of his text messages in and his responses, they're putting his defense on. Why would he testify now? Because his defense is in the record. They were telling me that they were into this. They were telling me that they liked this. They were telling me that they loved me. Yes, I'm an awful person, but this wasn't RICO. This wasn't a freak off. This was a consensual, bad relationship.
Shaun, thank you so much for coming and breaking that down for us.
Thank you so much.
That was Shaun Kent, criminal defense attorney from South Carolina, and that's it for this episode of Diddy on Trial from the BBC World Service YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss a thing. And keep sending us those questions on WhatsApp at +44 330 123 551. That's +44 330 123 551.